If not, we turn now to our second presenter, Admiral Dennis C. Blair, a former Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Command, one of the largest United States warfighting commands, and former Director of National Intelligence, the highest intelligence position in the United States government. Admiral Blair will address defense and security policy.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this important process. The fundamental national security challenge of a new administration is to restore a publicly supported, bipartisan, and enduring approach to America's responsibilities around the world. Winston Churchill once famously said that the United States does the right thing after it has exhausted all the alternatives. And since the Cold War ended in about 1989, we have been busy exhausting alternatives. However, we have not yet, I would say, figured out the right thing. In the 1990s, a series of interventions into smaller countries with some success, motivated in large measure by humanitarian concerns, but in part by fundamental American interests, such as the free flow of oil from the Middle East in the case of First Iraq War, alliance leadership in the case of the Balkans, supporting allies in the case of East Timor. Then after 9/11, we invaded Afghanistan to stop terrorist attacks from coming again from that country, invaded Iraq for a complicated set of motives, and then in both cases we improvised follow-on plans which we had not adequately prepared. A few years later, we were participating in toppling one Arab dictator in Libya while not doing the job against another in Syria. With regard to China, we combined sometimes friendly relations with sometimes great concern. So it's little wonder that the American people are confused, and the world that watches the United States is also confused. What does the United States want? What is the United States willing to do? It's not that forging a coherent national security strategy is easy, and there are many reasons why, since the end of the Cold War, it's particularly difficult. The first was that we enjoyed enormous military and economic superiority over any other country. If you have power superiority, you have little incentive to develop a clever strategy. Second, related, we had the lack of an overwhelming existential threat to compel the United States to set priorities, provide an overall national goal, and to have the capability to handle other lesser included threats. Our serious involvement in overseas affairs appeared to be optional. Third, and also related, the inevitable tensions between individual national interests, whether they were regional and functional, led to compromise and inconsistency in the absence of an overarching threat objective. For example, fighting terrorism versus promoting transitions to democratic regimes often conflicted and made our response to the Arab awakening very inconsistent. And the fourth factor was the growing polarization of US politics. Although national security issues have been somewhat less partisan than domestic issues, the antipathy between the major political parties has increasingly made forging a consensus difficult. And fifth and finally, September 11th played a role. The terrorist attacks by al-Qaeda had a shock value that caused a US reaction far in excess that the threat actually posed by such a small and stateless organization. Elevating that campaign to the country's top strategic objective interfered with the formulation of a strategy that could address the full range of threats and opportunities. So with all these factors that thwarted the development of an overall strategy that would set priorities, provide principles for action, guide resource allocation, successive administrations since 1989 have generally handled crises in an ad hoc fashion, taking the best short-term action decided on through a series of White House-led meetings that had increasingly tactical and small-scale focus. We've become tactical, short-sighted, and not terribly effective. A new administration has to turn this around. Part of the problem is process. Back in 2005, a group of us looked hard at the structures and authorities that we have for national security and found that that framework, which we'd inherited from the years after World War II, was deficient for going forward with the complicated sets of challenges that we face. I defy you to define a problem that the United States faces overseas that falls neatly into these traditional baskets of military force, Department of Defense, diplomacy, Department of State, Economics, Department of Treasury, and other organizations, so that we can simply hand it off from one organization to another. All of them have many interconnected, overlapping relationships, and we have to have an integrated strategy and integrated actions to put them together, and yet our authority and resource structure goes through the stovepiped departments, which only get together when you have good people making up for the deficiency of the system down at the level of the field, and we need to do better in putting together a structure that makes that possible, not the exception when exceptional people do it. We need new legislation or executive orders. We need to take this authority that the president has and be able to have it an integrated authority down at the field level. So fix the structural parts of national security. But then what do we do with the policy? As Dr. Moore described, we have a series of seemingly disconnected things going on all over the world. What's important? What's consistent? What's connected? In my mind, three challenges really rise above the welter of events which face us in the news every day. We have many more national security interests in this, and we have to address them, but I think we have to set a set of priorities. And I would characterize our top priorities as China, the Middle East, and violent extremist groups. In China, we've had a relatively successful strategy of trying to bring China into the world system, particularly world economic system, while setting some military bounds on some of China's claims to greater territory. But China has become so big now that it's not fitting neatly into either of those two alternatives that we sketched out for it, and we have to deal with China as it is in a more realistic way. In the Middle East, the series of civil wars which are racking the Middle East and which draw in nation states across national borders needs a longer term view in order for us to try to restore some measure of stability there. In the meantime, we also need to increase the energy security of this country. It's in the Middle East where the world's swing producers of oil are located. If there's problems in that part of the world, we have little ability to react to supply interruptions which cause price spikes, drag us into these contests militarily, and affect our economy. And finally, for combating these violent extremist Islamist groups that are working around the world, we need a better balance between helping the countries to enforce their rules in their own countries and taking direct action either through military or intelligence means ourselves. Actually, when you look at it, most of the threats to Americans in this country are caused not from overseas, but by our homegrown terrorists who decide that they want to kill a bunch of innocent Americans. They may receive some inspiration from overseas. They may receive a certain amount of instruction, but it's basically something that we have to handle with our security forces, the FBI, state and local security. And we need much better explanation to the American people of this balance between security on the one hand and privacy and the procedures that we use to safeguard our traditional rights on the other hand. So it's a tall order to get these priorities straight, to come up with long-term strategies, and to bring our institutions of national security together to address them. Let me turn to our military forces in particular, one of the important elements, but by no means the only important element of national security strategy. In the near term, we have to have the forces to handle these three biggest challenges that I outlined: deterring China from a military point of view in the Far East, applying appropriate military force to deal with the civil wars in the Middle East, and combating violent extremist Islamic groups spread through the Middle East and North Africa, and increasingly further south in Africa, potentially in Southeast Asia. We have to maintain forces to support our sustained alliance commitments in NATO, which is the backbone of dealing with Russia, and with to deter North Korean large-scale aggression while we handle the smaller provocations which are fomented on a continual basis by the North Korean regime. At the same time, there are three big sort of overarching places that we have to devote increased resources to. We have to modernize our nuclear forces, all three legs of the triad: submarine-launched ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles from land bases, and our bombers are all aging and will have to be replaced at great expense. And we need to have our space assets stronger and more resilient than they are now. And finally, we have to continue research and development and modernization to cope with and take advantage of new technologies, which are always coming up in military forces. Some of them that we know a lot about, like drones and versus manned aircraft, striking that right balance. Others that are important in terms of submarine warfare and anti-submarine warfare, missiles and ballistic missile defense. All of these will take resources and will take new weapon systems being brought into the case. What does this mean for the individual services? And realistically, when we look at the fiscal environment, it's always going to be under pressure for the great number of domestic needs, which we will hear about from some of the other participants in this process. So it's not that we can have a blank check for national security. If you take a look at recent history, after 9/11, we had a sharp increase in our national security spending, but for the last 5 years, the defense budgets and the intelligence budgets have been basically declining. This process cannot continue. We have to provide the resources in order to face these challenges that I outlined, do the sort of research and development, modernization, and the changes to our force structure that are needed. But what sort of a force structure will we need for the future? For the Navy and the Air Force, deterring China will provide plenty of capability for other contingencies that we may have to deal with around the world. So for the Navy and the Air Force, if we can handle deterring China in the various places that it is tempted to military aggression, Taiwan, South China Sea, the East China Sea, that'll be enough air and naval force to handle other things. For the Army and the Marine Corps, the challenge is more complicated. Deterring attacks in NATO and by Korea require maintaining the capability to conduct high-end combined arms warfare of major units. But we don't need the entire Army and Marine Corps to handle these missions. We do need a part of the Army and Marine Corps that can handle them. And these forces need to maintain and modernize the doctrine, the equipment, and the ability to expand in case a much larger nation-state threat emerges in the future. You can't do that by snapping your fingers. You have to be prepared, and then you have to react quickly when that threat appears. For dealing with these, what the Pentagon is calling irregular warfare in these days, civil wars in the Middle East, countries under siege in Africa, potentially elsewhere in the world, we need a range of assistance and support capabilities that are short of the commitment of major combat units, although there may be an occasion in which we do have to put major U.S. combat units into these situations. So both the Army and the Marine Corps need to be able to train and assist, if necessary, on quite a large scale or in many different places so that we can build up the capacity of countries that should be able to handle these sorts of threats eventually on their own. Think Afghanistan, think Nigeria, think Yemen, think Libya. We have learned that the commitment of major U.S. combat forces is both expensive and not always effective over time. It's often important to stabilize a situation quickly. However, effective advisors, in order to build up the local capacity to handle these things over time, is not something that you can do with just regular Marines and soldiers that you assign for a one-year tour. These need special skills. Some of our best trained and the most experienced soldiers, Marines, and others, and it needs an organization to be able to do it. Right now, these skills are concentrated within our special forces, a relatively small number, and we need to expand this greatly into our two services that handle ground operations. So the Army and the Marine Corps will have to maintain two different sets of capabilities within their force structures, as well as the capability to flex and to grow as the threats become clear and it becomes obvious what has to be done. So a lot of challenges for the national security, both policy and actions for the armed forces in the future. And I would finish up by saying if there's one question that if I were the newsman asking a candidate, it would be this, which is, how do you, Mr. Candidate, Madam Candidate, intend to break this trend of short-term ad hoc responses to world events, build a consistent national security strategy, gain bipartisan support for it, develop and fund the military forces and other resources to carry it out? And I think that we Americans should be asking that question in whatever form we can, and we should be listening very closely to the answer and hold our president to that. So thank you very much.
Are there any other questions for Admiral? Yes.
Admiral Blair, you mentioned the decision-making process. How would you improve the National Security Council system? There's now 400 people in the National Security Council staff. Should we double it, triple it, or shrink it down to 40 where it was
Right.
in some previous administrations?
All right. I would shrink it for a couple of reasons. I think we should keep that National Security Council at the highest level of making overall policy, staffing the president personally, and checking to make sure that we are carrying out our big goals. We should get it out of the business of trying to run with a 7,000-mile screwdriver tactical operations in the field, especially interagency operations. And I think we need to take that authority that the president uniquely has in our system now and find a way so that a president's representative in the field, be he an ambassador, or in some cases, if it's a chaotic situation, a military commander, is responsible for everything that we do in that country, military, diplomatic, economic measures, and is held responsible for that. You and I in our careers have seen this fuzzy area when orders come down from Washington through the departmental chains of command, the inability to break ties and to move in a unified position on there. And I think we're walking around with a huge weight tied around our ankle. And the answer to that is not to triple the national security staff and hold endless VTCs in which things are decided in Washington, which should be decided in the field, but to centralize that in authority in the field, and one person have everybody there work for that person. That would be my advice. Yes, sir.
What specific action should the next administration take to deal with the issues that are going to be confronted in the South China Sea?
I think we have to recognize first that China is making some what appear to be short-term military gains and potential military gains in the South China Sea, and are losing, in fact, the real battle in the Southeast Asia, which is for influence among the countries there. By building what are potentially military capabilities on far-flung bits of sand, they are driving the countries in the region, Vietnam, our ally, the Philippines, more closely, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, into coming to the United States to say, help us, support us, we're threatened, and we're willing to provide basing, we'd like assistance from you, or we want you to be stronger in the region. So in fact, the American overall position in the region is being made stronger by Chinese actions. In return for that, the Chinese are getting access to a series of islands which are 800 miles away from their main bases, and I can tell you as a former military commander, these are the work of about an hour and a half to neutralize if things get serious. So they're not serious militarily, and they're playing to our side. Nonetheless, they have two effects. Number one, they potentially restrict U.S. freedom of navigation. If China gains claim to this whole area and they try to enforce the same sort of rules that they do in their own exclusive economic zones in there, that's unacceptable to the United States, so we need to make sure that we are operating there and demonstrating that we can. And number two, it's sort of a case of rewarding bullying, rewarding coercion. And in order to handle that, I think we should more explicitly demonstrate what I just said, which is that these things are grapes from the military point of view by holding exercises and deploying military force to show that they can quite easily be taken care of, and then to support it. I would say also important is the United States and other countries that are concerned with this should help the countries that are actual claimants to come up with a more comprehensive solution. Divide up the islands, the exclusive economic zones in the South China Sea in a way that's equitable. Invite China to participate. If China doesn't, do it anyway. And that would give something that the United States could support and oppose, as opposed to simply saying we take no position on these islands. So we need a diplomatic framework, and then we need some military action, and then we need to take advantage of this wonderful opportunity the Chinese are giving us to improve our security relationships with Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, and other countries. Okay? Thank you.
Admiral Blair, thank you for a superb overview.